Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining our webinar, DDoS Attacks in Healthcare Security, How to Protect PHI. My name is Laura Levy and I'll be your host for the event today. Today we'll discuss the increase in DDoS attacks launched by cybercriminals against the healthcare industry and why protecting networks has become more critical than ever before. And we'll provide tips on how to implement proactive and automated DDoS and vulnerability protection. A few quick notes before we begin. Today's session will last about 40 minutes with ample time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. Please use the question field in the control panel of GoToWebinar to ask questions throughout the presentation, and we'll address as many as we can at the end of the event. Today's presentation will be recorded, and we'll provide all attendees with a link to the recording and make it available on our website at www.trustednight.com. I'd like to introduce our presenter for today, Ted McKendall. With over 22 years of information security experience, Ted is a certified information systems security professional and has gained expertise in a variety of roles from security consultant to product manager. Ted is the mastermind behind many cloud-delivered industry security solutions used by millions of businesses today. Ted is currently the Vice President of Product Management for Trusted Night. With that, I'll turn it over to Ted to get us started.
Thanks, Laura. Good morning, good afternoon. Before we begin and get into the topic for today, I'd like to give just a brief, at most 2-minute overview of Trusted Night and our background. We are a relatively small security company, but we've been around for several years, since around 2010. Our founders are from the intelligence community. We also have a number of folks from the enterprise data security industry. So we take this combination of technical expertise and product expertise, and we use it to bring simple solutions to challenging security problems to our customers. We currently focus in 2 areas. One is endpoint security, and on this side, we, unlike other endpoint products, which focus on keeping up with the latest variants of malware or virus signatures and so forth, we have a product protector that basically assumes that the device is already compromised, or if it's not, it will be at some point in the future. And we prevent that malware from actually doing harm on the system, from stealing credentials or exfiltrating data or interfering with processes or secure sessions. And we do that in a way that's very lightweight and low impact to the users on the system and any other endpoint tools that might be on the system. We take that same methodology and apply it to web security with our Cloud DMZ product. I won't spend too much time talking about that now because we'll talk about it at the end of the session. But suffice it to say, we take the complex challenge of enterprise web security and provide a very simple solution that's very easy for our customers to put in place and utilize. Okay, a quick overview of today's topic. We'll start with the DDoS threat as it applies to healthcare, how it's growing, and why healthcare needs to be aware of this threat. We'll dive into a few examples of the types of DDoS attacks and how these attacks can be mitigated. And then we'll touch on what I call the hidden risk of DDoS and why it's important to incorporate anti-DDoS solutions as part of an overall web security strategy instead of addressing it with a point solution. And finally, the last 5 or 10 minutes or so, we'll talk about the Cloud DMZ product that we have, and I'll give you a quick introduction to it and how it works. First, a few basic items. Anybody that's spent any time looking at security knows that kind of the general principles center around protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. That's, as those of you on the call know, is baked right into the HIPAA security rule that those safeguards must be in place for electronic PHI. However, in my experience, not just in healthcare, but in other industries as well, when we talk about sensitive data like PHI, the focus has traditionally been on the first two legs of that triad, the confidentiality and integrity of the data. Availability is important, but the majority of the focus in terms of resources, security technology, policy, et cetera, has been on keeping it confidential and safe. And this makes sense when you look at the risks and the threat landscape, right? The exposure of an individual's medical records, for example, or worse, perhaps the tampering with those records by an unauthorized person would have severe consequences. However, we do see that shifting, and we see it shifting because DDoS is emerging as a direct threat on the availability of this data. Availability meaning making sure that this information is accessible and usable upon demand by these authorized individuals like providers and patients. The factors that are contributing to this increase start with just a general increase in DDoS attacks across industries. So we'll touch on this on the next slide and give some statistics on this. Beyond that, in healthcare specifically, over the past 10 years or so, as you know, there's been an increase in the amount of data and services that are available online and the criticality of this data. Patients don't just look for doctors online, but they make appointments, they prepare for visits, they communicate with their doctors, they view test results, they view their records, they interact with their claims and EOBs online. All of their interactions primarily focus on online actions. And for providers and doctors as well, with electronic routing of prescriptions and communications with other doctors and accessing electronic health records that might be remotely stored, an impact on the availability of those resources could have an effect and stall or otherwise impact the delivery of care to patients. And we are seeing healthcare in some cases as a target of DDoS attacks. One of the first examples that I heard of was shortly after the launch of healthcare.gov a few years ago. There was I think arguably half-baked campaign to DDoS the site as a protest against Obamacare. I don't think it really was very effective, but that was the first thing I saw. And then a couple of years ago in 2014, one of the largest children's hospitals suffered an extended and sustained DDoS attack, which dramatically affected their ability to deliver care and services to patients. So we see this affecting healthcare, starting to affect healthcare. Let's touch on the rise of DDoS attacks across industries. So DDoS, the stats vary from quarter to quarter, but in general, the trend over the past several years has been for the number of attacks, the frequency, to increase. Looking at statistics from Akamai's Q3 Internet report, you can see that from Q3 2016 over Q3 2015, they recorded a 71% increase in the number of DDoS attacks, and that itself was a 180% increase over Q3 of 2014. So the trend is definitely a larger number of attacks, but perhaps more damaging is the severity of these attacks. We see them increasing in size as well. Again, the statistics vary from who's reporting them, but a report by VeriSign, for example, from Q3 shows that they tracked the average peak attack size at almost 13 gigabits per second, which represented an 82% year-on-year increase. And they track 30% of attacks that peaked at over 5 gigabits per second, which is far more than most organizations can scale to for any extended period of time, certainly. Whereas several years ago, attacks that are over 100 gigabits per second were fairly rare. Nowadays, those are commonplace. And in the past couple of months, these mega attacks, we've seen exceed even 1 terabit per second in volume, which is a tremendous amount of traffic inundating a target. So why are we seeing this increase? Well, the simplest and first reason is economics. These tools and services are becoming increasingly available and lower cost. We see booters and stressors services that are renting out DDoS service, and these what I would call DDoS as a service providers, who basically reap an army of infected devices to use as a botnet, and then rent out that army to perform DDoS in a way that doesn't require any technical expertise by the person who wants to perpetrate the DDoS attack. And the costs for these are not high. I see varying reports that the average cost is, can be as low as less than $20 per hour for a DDoS attack. We've also seen an increase, a lot of publicity around how the Internet of Things is affecting the growth of DDoS. Gartner estimates that in 2016, we're seeing over 5 million new devices connected to the Internet per day, which provides a vast field of possible targets for these botnets to take over and infect and incorporate into their denial of service attacks. And now we see attacks utilizing hundreds of thousands of these devices. In fact, the attack from late October, which affected the Dyn DNS service provider and actually affected dozens of popular websites and millions of users in the US, was actually traced back to and perpetrated by a botnet that was largely comprised of DVRs and security cameras. So these Internet of Things devices, which are designed with ease of use and convenience in mind, often lack the basic security features, even to get updates in security, so that they can be protected against compromise and incorporation into these kinds of botnets. We'll touch briefly on the motivations. Why do people perpetrate these DDoS attacks? Well, the most common and understandable one, I think, is financial. It's increasingly common for groups to target organizations, send them ransom notes, saying, "Hey, we're going to DDoS you unless you pay us." Pick a number: 5 bitcoins, 10 bitcoins, 50 bitcoins, and then often there's an increase in that fee if it's not paid within a certain time. It's extortion, pure and simple. And organizations often weigh the costs of this risk. A survey published by Newstar reported that 49% of respondents estimated they would lose at least $100,000 per hour if they suffered a DDoS attack during peak periods. So when you weigh that cost against, paying $5,000 or $10,000 worth of Bitcoin to someone who sent you this note, you might be inclined to pay them. In fact, there's also reports of financial institutions, for example, stockpiling Bitcoins in order to pay off criminals who threaten to DDoS them. However, I think this is a bad move, particularly because statistic after statistic shows that if you are hit with a DDoS attack or threatened with one, you will be targeted again. That same Verisign report, for example, that I referenced earlier, goes on to say that 41% of targeted victims were targeted multiple times during the quarter. So if you think you're going to pay once and get off the hook, you're probably not correct there. Outside of financial, there's a whole host of reasons why folks commit DDoS attacks, and these are the ones that typically get more publicity. They range from simple mischief-oriented ones, which could be an online gamer who DDoSes an opponent in a online multiplayer game in order to gain an advantage there. But then they get quickly more serious. In fact, that Dyn DNS outage that I referenced earlier was reported to have been initiated by someone who had a personal grudge against the Sony PlayStation network. And all it took was, I don't know what his technical sophistication was, but I think he effectively took around $7,500 and a visit to a dark web marketplace for him to cause such a devastating DDoS attack. Beyond that, they get into the protest. That incident I mentioned against the Children's Hospital, against Boston Children's Hospital, the attacker who allegedly perpetrated that attack published his statement in September in the Huffington Post, where he described why he did what he did and how he did it and his motivations. He was protesting the hospital in the way they, particular case, and he said that he wanted to hit BCH where they appear to care the most, which is their pocketbook and their reputation. So they were having an online giving campaign, and he targeted their online donations site, which was actually on the same network infrastructure as the rest of the hospital. So by taking down that site, or in order to take down that site, the entire hospital was effectively DDoSed, and that caused severe issues for them and affected their ability to deliver services and care. And then the ones that you hear perhaps the most about are the hacktivist and politically motivated attacks, which can be last summer, for example, several dozen Philippine government websites were compromised or were DDoSed in response to, allegedly in response to a dispute with China over the Spratly Island territorial dispute. Every year, you often hear about Anonymous associated with these kinds of attacks. Every year in April, Anonymous advertises their Op Israel, where they invite folks to DDoS popular Israeli websites and so forth. So those kinds of attacks are also motivations. The last thing I'll mention, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in more detail, is using DDoS as a cover for more targeted attacks. So we'll touch on that later. First, what I'd like to do is give you a quick overview of a few different types of DDoS attacks and some recommendations for how to mitigate against them. I'll start with what's really the most common kind of attack, a pure volumetric attack. The idea here is to simply overwhelm the victim with more network traffic than their infrastructure can handle. Just overwhelm them, frankly. These attacks tend to be connectionless. They tend to use lower level protocols like UDP and ICMP and just flood the network with traffic. If you have a 1 gigabit per second connection to the internet for your data center, and someone starts shoving 2 gigabits per second worth of data at you, no matter how intelligently you try to filter or route or block that traffic, it's just going to oversaturate your bandwidth and affect your service. The most common example of this that we see are DNS or NTP amplification attacks. I have a little illustration on the right here, but basically the way these work is they harvest their army of bots, as I mentioned earlier, and they target. They don't target the victim directly. They actually bounce their requests off of public DNS servers, and they structure the DNS requests such that they have a large number of devices or computers make relatively small DNS requests that generate very large responses from these DNS servers. And because they use IP address spoofing, the responses are not sent back to the actual bots, but they're sent to the victim's address. So it's completely irrelevant traffic, it's not even something that has anything to do with the victim's network, but it's a large volume of DNS or NTP response traffic that just floods their network and causes legitimate user sessions to be bottlenecked or dropped outright. These are probably the simplest to block. You know, some organizations might try to increase the scale of their network to handle the common attack sizes. I think that's probably not a winning strategy. There are some services you can work with your upstream ISP, or there are some on-demand sort of routing services. When you're hit with an attack, you can switch over your routing and have them try to scrub out, for example, UDP traffic before it gets to you. But I think those are limited in how many types of DDoS attacks they can actually affect. The simplest and probably most common is to use a cloud-based service that can scale and just sort of drop this noise. Common examples are content delivery networks or reverse proxy services that are delivered in the cloud, have scalability and large bandwidth capacity built into them, and are able to just drop all of this traffic out at the edge before it gets anywhere near your infrastructure or your website. Another type of attack is a protocol attack, and in this one it's slightly different. Instead of trying to overwhelm the network pipe, these attacks try to exhaust resources on infrastructure like a web server or a firewall. So example on the right illustrates how a slow LoRa's or Rudy attack might work. What these guys do is they establish not a large volume of bandwidth, but a large number of sessions with your web server. And they trickle information over slowly. The idea is that they want to keep these sessions open as long as possible, because a web server will have a limited number of connections, a pool that it can actually maintain at any given time. And so if they can keep all of these sessions open and just sort of spoon feed information, maybe they're sending 1 byte per minute or something like that at a slow rate to keep the session alive, it prevents legitimate users from having sessions opened with the server. They have to kind of wait in line. So to block these attacks, you can use kind of the same strategies. You can build out scale in your own infrastructure, or the ability to deploy additional, say, virtual instances of your website in order to scale in these kinds of cases. I think this is also a motivation for organizations to migrate their websites to cloud service providers, such as Amazon Web Services or Google or Microsoft Azure. There may be some re-architecting you need to do on your website in order to do this, and obviously that migration it takes some effort and work to do that, but the cloud provides a much more amenable environment to scaling and absorbing this bandwidth. A simpler and quicker approach is to use a service provider that's already in the cloud. Again, a content delivery network or some kind of proxy service can help here, because they can, the web sessions are terminated out in the cloud at the edge with these kinds of services, and they will deal with all of these extra connections and can automatically scale to absorb them without impacting your own web application for the most part. The last type of attack I'll talk about is an application attack. These are probably the least common, but the most damaging types of attacks. They're the least common because they do require a slightly higher degree of technical knowledge to perpetrate, but they are the hardest to stop, and they're the most impactful when they do succeed. And the reason is because they're not targeting something that is infrastructure or there's some quirk of a protocol. They're actually acting as legitimate users of the website, and it's very difficult to distinguish these attacks, the legitimate users from the the bots that are sending traffic to the site. So they will make, for example, legitimate HTTP requests for web pages or images or other resources on the website that look indistinguishable from real users on the site. And it's very difficult to just say, well, I'm just going to disregard this or disregard that because they look like legitimate users. So again, you can try to use a cloud-based or scalable architecture to absorb these attacks. Content delivery networks have some success but limited success in these environments. You really need to think through a strategy of how can you, in these cases where you can't use intelligence, like sometimes organizations try to use publicly available lists of known botnet IP addresses and block those. But that's an ever-changing, ever-evolving landscape, which might have some effectiveness but can't be universally effective. So in the event that we still get flooded, aside from those techniques, let's use a service that actually allows us to intelligently scale and absorb these attacks. And so you need to look for services that offer that kind of capability to really defend against these hardest of DDoS attacks. After that survey, let's revisit that third motivation I mentioned earlier, which is using DDoS as a cover for targeted attacks. There was a report described in Computer Weekly a couple of months ago where the respondents indicated that in the majority of DDoS attacks resulted in additional compromise. So in other words, after all the dust had settled from a DDoS attack and the crisis was over, more than half of the organizations recognized that there were viruses or other malware that had been left behind on systems in their environment. And in fact, that same report found that in 21% of cases resulted in customer data theft. And this is really where I think the biggest risk of DDoS in healthcare is, because healthcare, as we know, is one of the most targeted, and every year they're one of the most hacked industries. And even checking, for example, the HHS Wall of Shame for the first 11 months of this year, you'll see 93 hacking incidents that involved a loss of over 500 records. So it's very common because of the rich data that and the rich information that's available at healthcare organizations, they're frequently targeted. And so a sophisticated attacker can use a DDoS attack as a smokescreen, as a cover, one aspect of a broader campaign where they go in under that cover and steal patient data or other records. And this is the main reason why we recommend not trying to solve DDoS with a point solution, but incorporating it into your broader web security strategy. It's not just a scaling issue. It's not just a defacement or protest issue. DDoS is a security issue, and especially in healthcare, can cover for more serious attacks. We know that from many industry reports that applications are notoriously weak when it comes to security, especially web applications. In fact, the independent security evaluators released a report in February with a lot of findings around security of hospitals and healthcare centers, but in particular they noted that websites, especially custom websites, hadn't undergone any security assessment. And they give very simple examples where they could use a simple cross-site scripting attack to attack an EHR system and compromise the care of a patient if they wanted. They demonstrated that attack. So even blocking basic sort of OWASP top 10 type vulnerabilities like cross-site scripting, SQL injection, and so forth are things that you want to incorporate into your overall web security strategy. And then beyond that, there's targeted attacks, more sophisticated attacks that either use zero-day vulnerabilities or target the actual application and the logic used in that application. So availability and anti-DDoS strategies need to be considered as part of your broader web security strategy. At this point, we'll switch gears and talk briefly about Cloud DMZ. Let me give you an overview of that product and how it works. Cloud DMZ was designed in direct response to some of the challenges we've talked about. The increasing complexity of modern web applications makes it increasingly challenging to secure these web applications against the variety of threats out there. Not just healthcare websites, but statistic again and again show that the vast majority of websites have serious vulnerabilities in them, and identifying and mitigating all of these vulnerabilities is a nearly impossible task. So organizations look to combat this with different strategies. The best practice is security testing, which is code reviews, penetration testing, and so forth. But I think the reality is that most organizations lack the resources or the executive motivation to do this kind of testing on any kind of regular basis, except perhaps if they're minimally required to for compliance purposes. So an alternative and a recommended one is to use a web application firewall to defend your website. And I'll broadly classify two types of web application firewalls. One is a cloud-based filtering WAF that you might see as an add-on to a content delivery network, for example. Those types of WAFs take what I would call a blacklist approach. They're very good at blocking known threats, such as known attack strings or perhaps known bad IP addresses, but they are not very effective against zero-day attacks or targeted attacks against particular web applications. So they have limited effectiveness, especially when we're dealing with data as sensitive as PHI. At kind of the other extreme, we have full-on web app firewall. I'll call them appliances, although sometimes they're offered virtually. They can be very effective if they're properly configured, and therein lies the challenge with them. They often require specialized skills and usually a lot of time, whether it's a learning mode or configuration period or trial period, in order for them to build up a policy that's even close to being effective at protecting the web application. Cloud DMZ was designed to bridge this gap and bring together these two attributes. In other words, to take the simplicity of the cloud-based solution, yet provide the sophisticated enterprise-grade security of a full-on web application firewall. And we do this I think, a unique way. At our core, Cloud DMZ utilizes an active learning engine that proactively crawls the website. So rather than a learning behavioral mode where it monitors interactions with the website, it actively goes out and crawls the website that it's designed to protect. It inspects the website and interacts with it as a user would. It clicks all the buttons, pushes all the drop downs, identifies all the error messages and so forth, and builds out a complete analysis of the website. And then it does two things with that analysis. One is we actually build a secure replica of the static content from that website in the cloud. In our analysis and our experience with typical customers show that 95 to 99% of the transactions from a typical web application are requests for static content, which are HTML pages or CSS, JavaScript, images, those kinds of things. And by offloading this to a secure cloud replica, we effectively reduce the attack surface of the website by 95 to 99%. The other thing that we do with the analysis is we build out several layers of security policy to help protect the traffic to and from the website. Here's a simple illustration of how Cloud DMZ works. it has minimal impact on the customer's website. In fact, there's no changes required on the customer's website at all. The only thing that's necessary to use Cloud DMZ is to route your change your DNS so that your traffic routes through Cloud DMZ instead of going directly to your website. And as I mentioned, most of the traffic is offloaded to the secure replica, so never even reaches your website. One of the more powerful things we have in our security policy layers is a full application whitelist, which is enforced for all traffic that we see. So this is very effective at blocking unknown threats to the website, as well as the kinds of application layer DDoS attacks that other services are not effective at blocking. That, in conjunction with our secure replica, which can automatically scale to absorb large amounts of traffic if necessary, provide a very effective solution against all the types of DDoS attacks that we covered earlier in the session. Cloud DMZ was designed with security in mind. However, because of the architecture and the design of the product, it provides very effective solution against DDoS attacks as well. It improves the performance of the website. It improves scalability, and it provides a lower business drag in the event that businesses make application changes. There's not a delay in order to update the security policy because the learning engine automatically incorporates updates to the website into its replica and into its security policy. There is a management console that provides information about the website and statistics on traffic that we're blocking and other kinds of useful data and analytics. And it's very easy to test it out. Because it's all cloud delivered, there's no need to change anything on a customer's website, even just to try the Cloud DMZ service out. So with that, I will hand it back to Laura for any questions.
Sure, thanks, Ted. We have had a couple questions that came in throughout the presentation, and just a reminder for all of the attendees, you can ask questions via the question function in the control panel of GoToWebinar. So Ted, the first question we have is, where are these DDoS attacks coming from, and what percentage affect healthcare companies?
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't really talk about that earlier. In our experience, where the traffic originates and who's initiating the attacks can be quite different things. Most of the traffic that we see in a DDoS attack does seem to come from either China or the U.S. Or South Korea, places like that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's where the organizers of the attack are. I will say, though, that when it comes to healthcare, I think other service providers would agree that healthcare is not one of the top targets today in DDoS attacks. Most DDoS attacks target media or technology companies or online gaming, those kinds of industries. Healthcare is just a blip on a relative blip on the scale there. But I do think that the way that DDoS can be used to cover more targeted attacks on healthcare data in particular provides an extra incentive to make sure that this is incorporated into your overall security strategy.
Okay, great. Next question we have is, can you elaborate a little bit more on why CDNs can't protect against app layer DDoS attacks? You had mentioned something about that earlier.
Right, sure. So CDNs are great at caching content that is frequently accessed, but when they're faced with requests that they haven't seen before, they often just have to forward this back to the origin website. In fact, some CDNs don't even cache the HTML pages themselves. They focus on images and other peripheral content. And because they lack a whitelist, they don't know what pages or what resources are legitimate requests or not. So if you're getting flooded with legitimate looking HTTP requests, but for random resources, so that a CDN doesn't know which ones exist and which ones don't, it's going to forward all that information, all those requests back to the customer's website. The whitelist that we maintain in Cloud DMZ and that we automatically generate based on our analysis helps ensure that that traffic, that sort of spurious random traffic, never makes it past Cloud DMZ. So it won't impact the customer's website at all. There's also the notion of availability. In the event that something does happen to the customer's network or website, that secure replica we have, which again can service 95 to 99% of the customer's website, will be available even during those kinds of situations. So you've got a higher degree of availability as well as a more secure filtering mechanism to handle those kinds of attacks.
All right, great. Thanks, Ted. That is all the questions that we received today. So we'll go ahead and end the webcast. A big thank you to everyone who joined us today. And as a reminder, we'll be sharing the recording of this session with all attendees and on our website at www.trustednight.com. Thank you.